Hello, how are you today? In this video, I am going to test out lots of different kinds of salt and see which ones are best to use in watercolor paintings. When I did the 2 live streams testing out table salt with 100 Daniel Smith colors and then 108 Holbein colors, I got a lot of questions on which salt is the best to use, or does it make any difference? And I don't know personally, because I've always just used table salt and also Malden. So I thought it'd be great to test out lots of different salts and see which ones is the best. Can we just stick to table salt, or is something else better at doing the job? So I have 8 different kinds of salt. I have table salt, kosher salt, fine sea salt, coarse sea salt, low sodium salt, Malden sea salt, which is like a pyramid-y shape salt, flaked sea salt. I also have Himalayan salt and Dead Sea salt. In this video, we're going to keep everything else the same and just test out the different kinds of salt and see if we do get any variations in the patterns or how well it reacts with the watercolor paints. To test out the different kinds of salt, I created a simple chart for each of the salt. We are going to test it just on Holbein watercolors. We're going to keep that the same rather than start mixing lots of different brands into it. So we're just sticking with Holbein watercolors. And in the live stream that we did in testing out the Holbein watercolors with table salt, we found that there were 3 different kinds of levels of reaction, and we have the highly reactive colors, which are like the brilliant orange and queen magenta, and we have medium level where you get not so well defined feathering but you still get some reaction, and also the low reacting ones like here and here where you're not really seeing much of an effect from the salt. And for this test I am going to be using 2 colors per level. So for the high reactive colors I've picked brilliant orange and queen magenta, and for the medium level one I picked cobalt blue hue and opera. I picked opera just because it creates a different pattern to all the other colors that we have on the test, but it's still sort of a medium level reaction. And then for the low reactive colors I picked bamboo green and cerulean blue. So in this test I have a sheet for each of the different kinds we are going to be testing. We're testing 8 different salts, so we have 8 sheets. I will be using the same colors for each of the different kinds of salt as well. While we're here, I also want to talk about the anti-caking agents. Anti-caking agents are used in salt to stop it from clumping up and becoming just one solid salt. With the salts I've collected for this test, some have anti-caking agents and others don't. And I've noted that on each sheet. And strangely, because a lot of people were talking about kosher salt and a lot of people use it for working with watercolor and getting this pattern because it doesn't have anti-caking agent in it. However, weirdly, the kosher salt that I managed to get, and I had a real trouble trying to get kosher salt here, does have anti-caking agent. So I don't know if that's going to come into play, but I just wanted to make note of which salt did and didn't have and what kind of anti-caking agent it uses, because the 3 that uses anti-caking agent, they're all different, so that's another confounding variable as well. But it's just there to know in case you guys want to do further research into the chemistry of it, because I'm not actually that good a chemist, to be honest. So I'm providing you the information so that you guys can infer at your own pace and knowledge as well. But for me, I am just interested in testing out different ones to see if there are any variants in patterns that are created and an amount of patterns that are created with the different types of salt, rather than trying to understand the chemistry behind it, because that will be way beyond what I know. First up is table salt, and this is just one I've had for a very long time, as you can see, in the kitchen, and it's just any old table salt that you can find in the supermarket. Next up is kosher salt. This is a coarse kosher salt. I couldn't find a fine one or one without any anti-caking agent in it. I've actually never used kosher salt before, but that's what they look like. So the table salt was very, very fine grain and uniform, whereas this is going to be more flaky and uneven. So it'll be interesting to see what it does. Next up is fine sea salt that I just got from my local supermarket. And this again does have an anti-caking agent in it. As you can see, a lot finer than the kosher salt, but I would say it's a little bit coarser than the table salt that we've used at the start. Next up is natural coarse sea salt. So this should be pretty much similar to the previous one, only the crystals are much larger. This is actually larger than the kosher salt. As you can see, they're very big salt crystals. So it should be interesting to see how these turn out. Next up is low sodium salt. And this again does have an anti-caking agent in it. Now, to keep the salt low sodium, what they do is they actually blend two different kinds of salt. So you have the sodium chloride, which is your standard salt, and then they also add the potassium chloride in. So this is actually going to be two different types of salt, and then actually two types of caking agent as well. So we'll see how this goes. Low salt is very finely grained, very much like the table salt. Next up, we have molten sea salt flakes, and these are what I actually cook with the most, and they're quite flaky, but I tend to just crush them in between my fingers, and that's what I will do for this test as well. Actually, now what I'm gonna do is do the top half like as is, and then the bottom half like crushed, just to see if there's any difference as well, just for fun. Next up is Himalayan rose pink crystal salt, and this doesn't have any caking agent in it. The previous molten also didn't have any caking agent in it. So this has a grinder, so what I'm going to do is grind some into this plate area and then just use that and sprinkle that onto the salt. As you can see, the grinder has ground the salt to very fine grain. And this is a rock salt as opposed to sea salt, so we'll see if that brings any difference to the final patterns. And lastly, I have this big bag of dead sea salt, so we'll see how this does as well. As you can see, it's a medium grain salt, and it is just salt. There's no anti-caking agent in this one either. We are back, the paints have dried and so has the salt. It's very important when you're using salt with watercolor that you allow everything to dry thoroughly. I usually let everything dry for overnight to make sure that the salt is dry as well as the paper, because if you do try to remove the salt without letting it dry first properly, even if the paper's dry, you can get into all sorts of trouble. So yeah, it's good to leave it overnight and make sure everything thoroughly dry. When it comes to removing the salt, quick tip, the best way I've found is by using a palette knife like this. It's just a normal standard palette knife, but this shape is quite useful. And what I do is I just kind of gently scrape the salt with the palette knife, and I find that this is the most effective way for me in terms of removing the salt. You do have to be very careful though and be gentle so that you don't tear the paper underneath it. First up, let's look at the table salt, and we did test the table salt with the same colors before in the live stream with the Holbein colors, and these were the result that I got that time. Now, as you can see, in certain colors such as the opera, we got a different pattern again, and I would say that bamboo green had a little bit more of a reaction this time. And so this is kind of telling me that maybe it's not just about the salt versus color, it's also about the amount of water you use, and maybe also the timing of when you put the salt on the paint. Other than that, pretty much as expected. The Brilliant Orange and the Quinacridone Magenta reacted really well. The Cobalt Blue Hue and the Opera reacted not as much as these two, but still reacted. And then the Bamboo Green and the Cerulean Blue didn't react as much, although the Bamboo Green did get a bit of a reaction here this time around. Next up is the Kosher Salt, and this one was really interesting to me because if you see here with the Quinacridone Magenta, now this was a highly reactive color with the table salt, and for comparison, this was what table salt did to Quinacridone Magenta. However, you got barely any reaction with the Kosher Salt. So that's telling me, yes, different kinds of salt make a difference in terms of which color is going to react more or less. So I would say that the Quinacridone Magenta actually reacted less than even, say, the Opera, and quite similar to the Cobalt Blue Hue. Cerulean Blue reacted to the salt more than with the table salt. Again, here for comparison, this is table salt, this is Kosher Salt, and you definitely get a reduction in reaction in the Cobalt Blue as well. Now this is Coarse Sea Salt, and as you can see, this out of the three we've seen so far has the least amount of reaction out of all the colors, So I would say yes, the grain seemed to make a difference, but again, it's all different kinds of salt, so that is a confounding variable as well. And whereas we have the fine sea salt here that we tested after the course, and you do definitely get to see a lot more reaction in the Opera and Bamboo, and in all three colors of the Quinacridone Magenta, the Cobalt Blue Hue and the Cerulean Blue. On the topic of fine sea salt, I'm not quite sure what happened with the Brilliant Orange. I put too much water in to this and the salt just dissolved, and that probably was the case. So I did a new strip down here and I put salt on this strip as well. But again, there are some reaction, but nowhere near as much as, say, the Opera. And I put similar amount of salt on this in terms of density. And so I am thinking, again, here is where we find the different kinds of salt react to different colors better. And that's telling me that once you pick a salt of your choice for your art practice, then it's a really, really good idea to do your own salt reaction test with the colors you'd like to use, because it is quite unpredictable as to which one's going to work and which one isn't going to work depending on the type of salt you use. Next up, we have low sodium salt. Again, this was a fine grained salt, and we got some nice reactions happening here. Not so much down here, and very little reaction here. So again, this is where the types of salt reacts differently to different colors. Then we have the molten sea salt, and the molten sea salt was the ones that came in large flakes, and I left the larger flakes up on the top half of each color, and then I crushed the flakes into smaller grains in the lower half. And again, I would say that the Brilliant Orange and Opera is the most reactive, with almost no reaction to the Quinacridone Magenta and with the Cobalt Blue Hue, and no reaction here either. So I would put these two probably in the medium category. I wouldn't say it's really highly reactive. You don't get that nice feathering pattern that you get with, say, the table salt, And so again, this is another example where different salt is going to react differently to your colors. The next color I tested was the Dead Sea Salt. Now the Dead Sea Salt had slightly kind of a wet texture, but whereas all the salt dried overnight, not a problem. I don't know if the camera can catch this, but this is still very much wet. You see that shine? That's wet. And so it hasn't dried at all, basically, overnight. So this is the only salt that I would definitely not recommend using, because it doesn't react very prettily with the colors, but also I don't know how long you're going to have to wait until this dries, which is not very practical when you're trying to create art. The conclusion of this sheet is don't use Dead Sea Salt. Last up is the Himalayan pink salt. This was ground to almost a powder from the grinder that it came in. The most highly reactive one was the Opera, followed by the quinacridone magenta, which is nice because the quinacridone magenta has kind of been like the runt of the litter for quite a few salts with not reacting at all. So it's really nice to see the quinacridone magenta react. So what have we learned from this experiment? Well, first of all, don't use Dead Sea Salt because you're going to wait forever for the thing to dry. Second of all, I do have a feeling that the size of the grain of the salt you use does come into play when you look at the table salt, the fine sea salt and the low sodium salt, which are all finely ground salt, and also the Himalayan pink salt. They all had very fine grain. They worked so much better, they reacted more with the colors than the coarser ground salt like the kosher salt, the coarse sea salt, the molten sea salt and the Dead Sea Salt. I would say that the anti-caking agent hasn't really made a difference in terms of whether it reacts more or less. The table salt, the fine sea salt and low sodium did have anti-caking agent, but the Himalayan pink salt didn't have anti-caking agent in it, and that still did just as well as, say, the low sodium salt and the fine sea salt. In contrast, the kosher salt did have anti-caking agent, whereas the other three that didn't react so well didn't have anti-caking agent. So again, I would say that means anti-caking agent doesn't really have too much involvement in terms of how well the color is going to react to the salt. Talking of which, the third thing I learned is definitely that different salts react differently to different colors. So it's a really good idea, once you pick the salt that you want to use for your painting, to do at least like a few tests to see which of your colors are going to react to the salt in the way you want it in your painting. Fourth thing I learned is that you could use the same salt and the same colors, but there are other variables in the picture. So if you remember with the table salt, which this is the second time of me testing the table salt with these 6 colors, and I did get some variance in the result. So obviously that means other factors are in the play, maybe the amount of water, maybe the kind of paper, even though it was just a different weight of paper, it was the same brand, same finish. So those 2 factors and probably more factors are probably in the picture and worth experimenting with as well. As for which one I think is the best salt to use, because that's the question I get asked the most, I can tell you which salt I like the result of, and that's the table salt. I really like the feathering pattern that you get with using table salt. I kind of feel like that's the kind of pattern I'm looking for in my paintings, and so for me personally, I'm gonna say table salt is the best for me. You know me, I really struggle to say one thing is the best thing and you're wrong to use any other kind. I really don't believe in that. There's always going to be a right thing for somebody. It might not be the same thing that works for me. To answer the question of what is the best salt for doing this technique with, I can't actually answer that for you. What I can suggest is you have a good look at the result, maybe rewind it back to when we got to see each of the color close up, and decide which kind of pattern and reaction it is that you're actually looking for in your own painting. Maybe you are looking for these very localized, fine, small texture rather than the feathering one. Then I'd say pick the fine sea salt, low sodium salt, or Himalayan salt. If you are looking for this very dotted effect or even smaller reaction, then go for something that has a coarser grain. So which one would you pick? Would you pick the table salt, coarse salt, coarse sea salt, fine sea salt, low sodium salt, modern sea salt? I don't recommend the dead sea salt. That is one I am going to say straight out. Or the Himalayan pink salt. Let me know in the comments down below. And if you have used salt in your painting, then do let us know in the comments down below how you use the salt and what you use the salt for, because that is a question I get asked a lot. And me being an abstract painter, I'm like, I just throw it on. I don't try to make it look like something else. So if you are into more realistic painting and you use salt, then that knowledge of what you use it for would be incredibly valuable to everyone else. So it would be awesome if you could leave a comment down below about that. If this experiment was interesting and useful to you, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please do so. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!